the ratio of the weight of the standard bass bow to the tension and size of the bass strings is a little bit more like the relationship between a half-size violin bow and the violin.
Today's guest is definitely a top contender for most interesting bassist out there right now. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting again around 2 with Donovan Stokes. I've known Donovan for years. He was on the podcast in the early days. I think it was 2007, if I remember right. And we've been at... I feel like I see Donovan all the time, although as we were chatting before this interview, we were both teaching at the Golden Gate Bass Camp. I think it had been a year since I'd seen him, but I just feel like he's a longtime friend and colleague and someone that I just derive so much inspiration from. And I've had so many questions about what he does. And we took some time at the Golden Gate Bass Camp here to talk about gear. That's all we talked about today, about bows, about basses, about strings, about all that kind of stuff. And we will certainly reconnect soon for more topics, but that's exactly what today's show is, a deep dive on gear and why Donovan uses what he uses. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, A440 D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, and Robertson & Sons, and we'll hear more from them in a bit. But let's dive into this conversation, filmed live, or recorded live, I guess, at the Golden Gate Bass Camp in San Francisco with Donovan Stokes. Donovan Stokes, who I talked to in like 2007, but who's kind of been on the podcast a bit. I talked to you on the phone for Golden Gate Bass Camp, I think, last year.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And so, but this is officially round 2, even though kind of sort of been on in the past. So I have a whole bunch of questions. And we are about to play a concert in 33 minutes, so there'll definitely have to be round 3, because I'll only get to a few of them. But let's just start by, if you don't mind, by talking about gear. And can we talk about bows and your bow or bows? And can you describe your bows?
Well, my bows are a little heavier than your standard bow. They're around 260 grams. I have 3 of them, and they're all right around that size. They're a little longer than normal, but that's more specific just to what I wanted for me specifically. But in terms of the weight, there's a theory behind that.
That's what I'm interested in.
And a couple of different people, it's not my theory, I didn't come up with it, and a couple of people kind of came up with similar ideas for a heavier bow. Hans Rolofsson was one fellow, and then Rodion Azarkin, the Soviet/Russian bass soloist, was another, and they came at it maybe from different directions, but the bottom line of the idea is that the ratio of the weight of the standard bass bow to the tension and size of the bass strings is a little bit more like the relationship between a half-size violin bow and the violin.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. And so they were trying to get something that was a little closer to maybe a cello ratio. And in Azarkin's case, he really started thinking about it when he switched from gut strings to seal strings. He thought, well, I just increased the tension under the bow, but I haven't changed anything about the bow itself. And so that was where he came from. And they didn't have a lot of money, so
okay.
It was just, if you look at his, you can look at the Samuel Applebaum books, and then there are a couple of pictures available. He basically just put lead weights all over the bow and had this weird clarinet key type of thing, and he's a German bow player that he sort of put in there that made accents, and it just made everything really heavy. And I'm not exactly sure, I can't recall right now how heavy his bow was, but it was in the 245, 250 range. Most of my students use a regular bow, but I have had a few that sort of get transitional bows. They're not fully convinced on the 250 range, and so they end up with something maybe 220, and seem to be happy with that. And it's not that you can't play, obviously, with a standard bass bow, but it transfers a little bit more weight into the bow, and it does allow, it does require a slightly different technique, although the basics are the same, but you're allowing, the bow can do a lot more on its own. At least that's the theory.
And what are some of the technique different? And before I even ask that, the first thing someone might think about a bow that's 240 grams or that area is like you'll be exhausted playing. Well, I can say I was just playing Donovan's the second and third movements of his most recent concerto, and we must have run that thing 4 times in a row, and it is nothing but Donovan like all over the bass, and like if the weight of that bow does not apparently hold you back in terms of exhaustion, which is something I would think about.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously to move it left and right takes a little bit more effort, right? Or to hold it above the string would take more effort. But in general, we're not holding up the bow. In general, the string is holding up the bow, and we're just balancing it. So, or at least the way that I hold it, I can kind of balance it between just thumb and second finger, and that would be fine. And so it doesn't actually take a lot of effort to do that. It does take a little bit more effort for some of the bouncing strokes. And it does take a little bit more effort to go left and right, but it's not that much. The main difference that in fact, to back up, and I used to have, in my efforts to play with a lot of volume, I had some muscular issues, and, I have to go see a chiropractor every once in a while. When I switched to the heavier bows, that all went away. So I haven't found it to be a hindrance. It did require that I make sure that everything is loose and perfectly balanced, because if you are unduly tight, you can have a problem because it's a heavier bow. You can sort of get away with some of that on a lighter bow for whatever reason. So you have to be really careful about that. And it does become much more about sort of, maybe the way to describe it is that you're really sort of balancing the bow in your hand the way one might control basketball if they were dribbling, right? So you're not really ever holding on to it. And that's probably the way that you should be doing a regular bow anyway, but sometimes we have to have a little bit more pressure and we might tense up a little bit. So it does, I guess, require some refinement of the techniques, but the basic thing is the same. It does take a little bit extra muscle, but it's not that much. I mean, you would think, one might think that it would be a huge change, but I mean, we're not even talking about a half-pound difference,
right?
And if you have trouble, if you can lift a half-pound but not a full pound, you've got bigger issues than playing the bass. So it seems to be, I don't know, it works for me. And I feel like not only the bow responds a little bit differently, but that I get more out of the bass. And I don't mean just volume. I mean, like some of the lighter strokes, seems to be a fuller resonance and a quicker response. And I'm well aware that this is a controversial topic, but this has been my experience. But because I'm well aware it's somewhat controversial, this is a main reason I don't push it on any of my students. If they're interested and they feel like that their hand is in order, then we can talk about how to transition over. But otherwise, it's not like it's not gospel with me.
Yeah, you're not starting a 240 gram revolution.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So.
A struggle that people who teach young bass students, and there are more and more of us every day that are doing this, a struggle that these folks have is finding strings for these small basses, the 16th size basses and even smaller. Here's Kate Jones, who is a Suzuki bass specialist, on how she's enjoyed using D'Addario's fractional helicore strings.
Recently, I've had the opportunity to try out D'Addario's new 1/10/1/16 crossover size string for fractional basses. The things that I love about this string is that it's got a beautiful tone, and for tiny humans, the strings have to be easy to push down, which these strings are, and also they're easy to bow for them. You don't have to use a lot of arm weight. So overall, I think this has been a really exciting string for my studio.
Learn more at contrabassconversations.com/strings, and thanks to D'Addario for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the A440 Violin Shop. It's located just down the street from Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago on the north side, just off the Brown Line. I have been going there my entire adult life, and they have been fantastic, both for repairs. I've had cracks repaired. I've had seams glued. I've had all sorts of students go to A440 to get instruments, to get bows. They're available with a smile, do wonderful work, and definitely check them out if you are in the Midwest. A440violinshop.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. And then, speaking of the bass, there are many things about the way your bass is set up, the number of strings, the tuning, and again, we'll dive into more of that in round 3, I'm sure, because we can only get to set. But can you maybe just describe the ways in which your setup might depart from your standard 4-string straight pin orchestral tuning setup? Sure.
Well, yeah. So when I'm not in the orchestra, I use an angled pin, sort of a Roboth style pin. It's got a false block on the bottom, but that's mainly just because the bass is old. It's not because it's special design. I use a Marvin tailpiece on this bass. Seems to brighten things up. And allow for a little bit more projection. I do have 5 strings, but I tune it with a low C because I have a C extension, and then I take the other 4 strings and pull them up into solo tuning. So if I didn't use the extension, it would be E, and then B, and then E, and then A, and then D. With the extension, obviously, it's C, B, E, A, D. But all of that is actually on a 4-string neck. Oh. So it's the distance between the strings, if my recollection is correct, is something like 21 millimeters between strings. So it's much closer than a normal setup. And the way I figure, I just basically experimented, and I was like, all right, how close can I get them without them rattling? And I think that's the main differences off the top of my head.
And then just a follow-up question about the Marvin tailpiece and your specific setup. You have, and I can take a photo of this so people can see, but you have, do you have wolf eliminators on some of the strings too, or there's like an angular, the extra net?
That's something that's in progress. So I like years ago, I had a tailpiece where you could tune the afterlength. And my experience has been, if I can tune the afterlength of the string to 2 octaves and a fifth, that I get rid of all the wolves, and it's a little bit brighter and more projecting. The Marvin doesn't quite... it works great, but it doesn't have that ability. And so I'm currently experimenting using those wolf tone eliminators to tune the afterlength of the string as best I can. I'm hoping to find some solution that would allow me to have the lightness of those wires, but then be able to have that specifically tuned, those afterlengths. So
with the Marvin tailpiece and the one uses that for, and lots of people use it. It's a commonly used thing. But one uses that. Is it to increase the ring of the string, the resonance of the bass, the brightness, the tone? What are some of the reasons why one might, or why you use it?
Yeah, I think a lot of people say, different things, but I found that it made it a little brighter.
Okay.
And that it also made it seemingly freer and a little bit more resonant, and so therefore a little louder. It doesn't work on every bass. I mean, I have heard it on basses where I was like, yeah, no, I don't like that. And I have had some people say that when they put it on, it made it so ringy that it sort of like everything, it was no longer clear. But I did it because it was cheap to try, so it was easy to take a risk. And then, yeah, it made it brighter. The harmonics seemed to come out more clearly. The overtones seemed to be much more present, and that's why I use it. So
now the idea of five strings, top four solo tuning, and then the C extension. I know that Edgar Meyer, who you studied with, and other people do this too, but the solo strings on the top and then the drop D tuning, but really, or drop E tuning, but really C. Yeah. But then the fifth string, what was your inspiration for that?
You know, I always wanted it.
Okay.
You know, and I just thought, what kind of cool things could you do with that? And then one day I could finally afford it. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of it. I mean, it turns out that, turns out that, you know, since that time, I've, become aware of Renaud Garcia Fons, and he's got the 5-string tuned up, and it's really wonderful. And I think he says something, that I kind of agree with. It sort of makes the instrument, he calls it more complete, but if you think about it, like, on a violin, you can reach, what is it, like, let's see, 1, 2, a little over 2 octaves in a single position. And we get a little closer to that with the extra string and all of that. And I didn't want to give up the low notes, so I wanted to have the C and the D, or capo and E flat if I wanted to. Yeah, so
it's the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
It's and Adam Ben Ezra is doing that.
Right.
Although I don't know.
That's right.
I don't remember. Is he in solo tuning? I can't recall off the top of my head.
I can't either, but I know I think Nick Lloyd made him a bass, right? Yeah,
exactly.
And it's got that same tuning. So, I don't know if it's the wave of the future or not, but I like it. And, if you get the right kind of string on top, it's not so offensive, because that's sometimes the big thing about the high C or high D is that all of a sudden this one string is super bright, right? Yeah. It doesn't sound like a bass anymore. It sounds like a harpsichord, but bowed harpsichord.
Do you have am I remembering? Do you have a Kaplan on top, or
it's an obligato?
You have an obligato on top.
Yeah.
And what's on the rest of the bass?
They're the flat chromes. Not flat chromes. They're chrome steels.
Chrome steels. Okay.
Yeah. And the obligato, they'll make it for you because they did a run of them, but you have to special order it, and you have to buy them in groups of 3.
Okay.
But I heard Diana Gannett playing in the high C tuning using one of those obligatos, and I was like, oh, you can have a high D that doesn't sound like it's being played with a saw, right? Yeah. It was smooth and round, and yet still bright and able to project, and so I'm just really happy with actually all those Parastros. So.
When did you start? Because this is your tuning. This is your bass. This is the world you live in. Just to pitch. When did you start doing that? Was that at Vanderbilt? Was that later?
I started with the 4-string. EBEA. Like 1993. So it was when I was in Vanderbilt, and I just decided to do it all the time.
And so I'm assuming when you play what would for most basses be an open D string, but it's your open E string. Are you transposing, or is that E to you?
Yeah, it's an E to me. I mean, I try to think of it just like if you played the cello, you wouldn't be transposing. You just think this is a different string. I found it a little easier to sight read, right? And so now what becomes a challenge is to read it regularly, like play the Dragonetti, but play that first note as an A, or read a G, but play an A. That becomes sometimes a little tricky for me. But yeah, I tried to not transpose, and that was just, that was too much mental work for me. So it was easier for me to just sort of retrain a little bit. But I still, when I play the rockabilly band, I still play fourths. And so I have a bass there, and when I go back and forth, I just change my mindset rather than transpose.
Oh, so your rockabilly bass is in fourths and GDAE?
Yeah, normal everyday.
So it's
tuning,
just a different instrument in some ways to you. Okay.
Yeah.
Or in many ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, I didn't add the top string until, I don't know, what 7-8 years ago, but it's since I moved to Virginia, and I've been there 10 years, so. Maybe it wasn't even that long, but that part's relatively recent, but the rest of it's old. So.
This episode is brought to you by Robertson and Sons Violin Shop, and something that so many bassists struggle with on their instruments is the wolf tone. Here's Don Robertson on some methods of decreasing wolf tones in a double bass.
Decreasing the wolf tones, thinner strings, less tension. That always helps.
Thinner strings, really?
Yeah, if you put heavier strings on, then the wolf tone really gets very strong. So sometimes the raised saddle can make a difference. The sound post rarely makes a difference with the wolf tones. We've moved the sound post every possible position. But the basic thing about the sound post is you don't want it too tight in there. If you think of that bridge rocking in there, what is the sound post doing? It's being driven like a piston against the back. And if it's too tight, then the top is pushed in the up position and the back in the out position, then it really can't rock as it should. So a post well fitted, not too tight, all those things really help.
Learn more about everything that Robertson and Sons offers, including a fantastic selection of new and vintage instruments at robertsonviolins.com. One thing that has impressed me about Upton Bass ever since I got to know them was how many artists there are out there that are so satisfied with the work that Upton has done for them. Here's Lucia Torino of The Devil Makes Three, outstanding band, on her experiences with Upton.
I have the Upton travel bass. A friend of mine who was in a band called Brown Bird, I think she'd had some work done on her bass, and she had a pickup that she got from Upton, and she knew one of the guys who worked down in the factory in Mystic. Also, calling it a factory is really charming because it's really just a barn that smells amazing with lots of cool basses and very sweet men. Chris Wood, I think he had 2 Chadwick basses with him, and so I got my courage up and sort of sidled over to him at one point and was like, I need a bass, what should I get? And I talked about Chadwick and about Upton, and he was like, honestly, I'd go with the Upton.
Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. I'm going to radically switch gears just for a second, but heavy metal.
Yeah.
How steeped in was that one of your first musical experiences with that? How did you come into metal, and what impact has metal had on your writing? And I just asked that because I rock out so hard to Donovan Stokes music. I hear it. I always had it. It was yesterday. It's obviously a big part of your composition. Just tell me about metal.
Well, I mean, it wasn't the first thing. I mean, I started when I was 3 playing piano, and there was always an eclectic mix of music in the household, but probably late middle school I started getting into punk and thrash and that sort of thing, and it was in a bunch of bands and even made a demo, and I played and I kept that up for a while. Even when I started college, I was up in Seattle, and I was played with a guitar player who played with this punk band called The Accused for a while. It was just, I don't know where I found a place for my youthful angst. But I always had a lot of respect for them. I always found them to be, I mean, the music aside, they were always exceptional instrumentalists and fantastic musicians, and they would do things that you wouldn't hear in other types of music, not only harmonically but rhythmically, and maybe some polymeter, or switch back and forth between 2 and 3, or go into a 5/8 bar or something, And so it kept my interest, and it was sufficiently rage filled. I don't know, it just sort of sticks there, and I just I like the tonal, the harmonic sort of landscape of it all. And I always found it interesting that you could redefine 5/1, right? So they always talk about the 5/1 cadence, but really in that music, it's the flat 5/1 that serves to tonicize a key. And so I always found that interesting. And also, maybe because so many of them, it's not that they're not educated, but they don't think necessarily I'm going to play in this mode for the whole song, that they'll switch between similar modes, and you end up having a song that uses all 12 chromatic notes and yet somehow is still in the same key. Mm-hmm. And sort of tonality by assertion. And so I don't know. I found all that
tonality by assertion. I love that.
Yeah, and so I found all of that stuff really really interesting to me, and it has definitely had a big influence. So,
if someone isn't into metal, any top 5, top 2, top 3, whatever metal records.
Well, I'm going to be dated because I haven't kept up with everything, but. Pretty much anything by Slayer. Yes. And I might get the title wrong, but the Megadeth that has Holy Wars on it, and I think it might be called Holy Wars, right?
Yeah, I had all these albums on cassette, in the late 80s. This is you're speaking my language.
And then there's a more recent Megadeth, maybe the song called "Take No Prisoners." That's, I think, absolutely essential. How many did I give already? I don't know. 3?
Enough.
Yeah. Okay.
Plenty.
Yeah.
Plenty. Yeah. Well, bands like Slayer or whoever. Instrumental virtuosity. It's just phenomenal what technicians, but beyond that, like just the technical.
But in
facility.
the service of the music, as opposed to just here's a lot of fast notes. Like right. There was always in service to the music, and it seemed to me to be related to. The way you read about Paganini's performances, which is there had been a ton of people with fast fingers and fast bows before Paganini, but it was a fact that he could do everything in the service of the music that was astounding, right? So, because you can look and see these Locatelli caprices and everything. They were clearly great instrumentalists, and I always felt like those heavy metal thrash guys, it was the same thing, which is they had the technique to do anything they want, but they didn't just use it to, like, here's some fast notes or whatever. It was always in service to some sort of character or emotion. So.
What do you? So I've seen you perform many times, but one of the most remarkable ones to me was the 2016 Prague Bass Europe convention. You got up and you played, and I forget exactly what you played, but I just remember putting myself in your shoes, getting up there, and it was just beautiful. And there's nothing to me that strikes terror into my heart than playing for an audience of bass professionals. I think Gary Carr said similar things too. And so if it were me, I would have been quaking in my boots. You seemed just like cool as a cucumber in any of those sort of situations, and you just had this technical and musical, but just this brilliance pulling these pieces. What your concerto yesterday that you were playing, or in Prague. What the heck do you do? And I know we don't have time to dig too deep into this, but what the heck do you do to keep yourself in working order to do that? Like I know you were working with some of the kids on a technique regiment. What's just in broad strokes, like what do you do on a daily or semi-regular basis to be able to do what you do? In
broad strokes, I've done my best to break down, obviously with help and reading other, pedagogues. It's not like it's all my brilliance or something, but to break down the essentials of every part of the technique, right? So like on the string, off the string, what exactly happens, what are all the movements of the left-hand fingers, what are the basics of shifting, break it all down into as small a component as possible, and then create an exercise that will make sure that you hit every single one of those things in the course of about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. So if I'm doing this correctly and I have time, in an hour and 15 minutes, I can make sure that I'm at least maintaining what I already know, and I'm able to do physically for hopefully every type of bow stroke, every type of left-hand thing that could happen, and any kind of right-hand pizzicato thing that can happen. And it's sort of just technique, and it's broken down pretty separately. So, only right hand, only left hand, only pizzicato, that sort of thing. And the more I do that, the better off I am.
Okay. So our round 3 will have to be what that is in greater detail, because I think it's really remarkable to just, and I love routines. I just think it's totally fascinating to dig into. So,
happy to do it.
Okay,
yeah.
well, we will definitely do it, and we will be seeing each other again soon. Maybe we'll be doing it in Luca. Who knows? We're going to be there next month.
Oh, God, is it that soon?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's next. It's only slightly more than, it's as we record June 22nd. I think it starts July 28th or something like that.
Oh, my gosh.
I know.
Okay.
Well, you enjoy your flight back to the East Coast. I will be seeing you soon at DonovanStokes.com and Shenandoah Conservatory and everything else you do. So thank you for doing what you do. And I can't believe we haven't actually sat down, or we've never sat down and chatted like this.
Never like this.
But anything long form and extended, it's been over a decade. So let's make it much shorter than that. Maybe a month.
Great.
Okay. Thanks,
Thank you,
man.
Jason.
Donovan, thank you so much. Learn more about everything he's up to at DonovanStokes.com. And thanks for chatting, Donovan. I know we'll do it again soon. I have such a great time doing these podcasts, and I'm so glad that you're listening. If you haven't subscribed, you can do so at contrabaseconversations.com/subscribe. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say subscribe, it's free. There are lots of ways to do it, and it's all explained on the website. And while you're there, why don't you send me a message and let me know what you like about the show, what you'd like to hear more of, who you'd like to hear from. That would be so great. And you can reach out to me at feedback@contrabaseconversations.com. Contrabase Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And if you're looking for a bass, Mitch is making beautiful instruments. I was just in person checking out one of his instruments at Oberlin for the VSA workshop. All of his info is at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper for archiving and cataloging all of these episodes. It's a tremendous task. Really appreciate it. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you from San Francisco, California, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.